Okay, hello everyone. Jim here. I guess we're going to start in. We expect some more to join us, but they must be getting a little bit of a late start. So, hope everyone is doing well today. This is our sixth and final webinar of the winter season. This one is entitled, Why Crop Rotation is an Organic Potato Farmer's Best Friend. As some of you have joined us before, we've got 5 other webinars which we've done, and they are all posted on our YouTube channel. And as soon as this webinar is completed, we'll work at getting this uploaded to YouTube. So by tomorrow, it'll be up, and we will send every attendee on this webinar an email with the link. So if you want to hear it again, or if you want to share it with friends, you'll have that easy opportunity. Okay. So here's a map. I got 2 history lessons for you today. This is a map from 1820. Several things are significant about this, but Maine used to be part of Massachusetts, and Maine gained its independence from Massachusetts in 1820. Prior to 1820, Maine was known as the District of Maine, and since 1820, we've been known as the State of Maine. And I think this is quite a classic map. The northern half of Maine, up where we are, I would say that down in Boston, all they knew is that they owned the land, but they had no idea what was up here, nor did they really care. By 1820, there had been a settlement established in Holton, Maine, which, if you look, and there's a brown squiggly line in New Brunswick heading up, that's the St. John River. And the settlers came up from St. John and Fredericton and on up to Florenceville, and then came inland from that point. So, from Woodstock to get over to Holton. So that was 1807, and some Acadian French had settled in the very northern part of Maine in the 1790s, 10 or 15 years prior to that. And then the first settlement that we had here in Bridgewater, that came also from the St. John River through Florenceville into Bridgewater, the Canadian border, 6 miles away from where our farm is, and that was 1827. So 7 years after this map was done, clearly they had no idea what was up here. It was really one of the, for as close as we are to Boston as the crow flies, they didn't really have any clue as to what was going on up here. And the settlement took quite a few decades to get the population up, and then the big change was in the 1890s when they brought in the railroad, and that allowed potatoes to get hauled out to eastern markets efficiently and effectively. And at that point, acreage of potatoes grew dramatically and the population expanded, so it was all centered around potatoes. Another historical point is that this week we're celebrating the 5th anniversary of the filing of our lawsuit, which became known as Oscata et al. V. Monsanto. I continue to serve as president of Oscata, and Oscata stands for Organic Seed Growers and Trade Association. And this was a major federal lawsuit which sought to challenge Monsanto's genetically engineered seed patents, and also to provide court protection to farmers that, should they through no fault of their own become contaminated by Monsanto's seed, that they would not be subject to patent infringement litigation. So if you're interested in this lawsuit, learning more about it, Frank, would you type in? Okay, Frank has typed in a URL for an article in which I was interviewed about a year ago by the farm publication Acres USA, and it's a very extensive, detailed article. It's a 10,000-word article, so it goes into great depth about the background on this lawsuit and what we were able to achieve with the ruling from the federal Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in Washington, D.C., which was the highest level that we were able to achieve. We did appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, but they passed over our case, so the ruling of the U.S. Court of Appeals stands, and that did give, while it was not by any means a perfect ruling, it did for the first time in U.S. history grant every farmer in the United States limited protection from Monsanto's bullying. And if you'd like to find out more about it, I encourage you to read the article that talks about our farm as well as the lawsuit. So Frank's got that listed there as a hot link. Okay, so I want to start out, and this is I'm gonna ask you to answer my question of what have we got going on here, and let me see. Okay, so what I want you to do, and you can use the chat feature, which maybe I should have mentioned before, but throughout today's webinar, feel free to ask us any question that you have whenever you want to ask it, and you can communicate to us as you type it. It shows up on our screen, and I'm happy to answer your question whenever you have it. So we can use that same mechanism to offer your guess as to what we've got going on here. So I'll start to offer some hints, and we'll see how quick some of you can piece together what this is. So this was a photograph I took this morning. All of the potatoes are a single variety, and that variety is Butte Russet. And if you had joined us for the first webinar back in December, we focused quite a bit on Butte, and then we actually had finished up that focus in the second webinar. But Butte, as you may or may not know, is probably the best quality russet. It's a late season variety, bred in Idaho in the 1970s, bred by Dr. Joe Pavick. It's a great variety when compared to Russet Burbank, which it was out to replace. It has a 20% higher protein content than Burbank and a 58% higher vitamin C content than Burbank. Anyway, it's one of our favorite varieties. It is every bit a workhorse variety. And this situation that we had this winter affected far less than 1% of tubers, but it's something we've seen before in Butte. So if it occurs to you what this might be, give us your answer, and I'll start to give you some more hints. Now, I did mention that Butte is a late season variety, and the way we do things in Maine is when we're planting in the spring, we plant our late season varieties first, and we finish up the planting process with our early season varieties. Then we grow the potatoes over the summer, and then in the fall, we start harvesting the early varieties first, and we harvest the late varieties last. So if you think that through, that allows us to get the longest possible growing season for late varieties, which in our short season in our short growing season up here, that's a necessary requirement. So Butte typically are one of the last varieties to be harvested. That's my first hint. Another thing is, if you look at these, I've kind of got those potatoes stacked log fashion, one on top of the other, and all of the damage on these tubers is on the same end, and that is what we call the seed end. It's where there's a concentration of eyes, and the seed end on a potato tuber is always the opposite end from the stem end. So visualize how potatoes are growing in a hill, and this is my next hint. Okay, you've got your central stem growing upwards out of the seed piece, and then from the lower portion of that stem, you have stolons coming out from the central lead, and then those stolons start to swell, and then they become tubers. So the stem end is going to be the end closest to the center of the plant, the center of the hill, and these tubers have all got their problem on the end opposite that stem end, on the seed end. So visualize how those tubers are growing in a hill, kind of splayed out spatially, with the stem end in towards the center and the seed end out towards the outside. Now, this may be a little bit of a challenge for those of you that are in a moderate climate. Here in Maine, we start to cool off. Once we get into October, it can turn rainy and it can drop temperature pretty dramatically. In fact, I couldn't tell you exactly how many degrees, but the average temperature on October 1st compared to October 31st is a big difference. October is a month where the sun is already pretty low in the sky in northern Maine, and the nights can get pretty cold. And I'll tell you this, that the day that we went to Harvest Butte this year, we were all set to harvest first thing in the morning, but as it turned out, we had to hold up for a couple of hours because of weather conditions, and that is my next hint on this. It was a cold night, 10 or 15 degrees colder than they had predicted, and we were not able to go on time. So the reason was that we had frozen ground. Now, when you are growing potatoes, you hill them up, so you've got a hill that is elevated from the earth, and once you get into temperatures beginning in the high 20s, especially down to the mid-20s, you start to get frost freezing the top of the ground. And it's not unusual for late season potatoes up here to, on a cold morning, maybe get 3 inches of penetration by frozen ground. So if you envision a hill of potatoes that is maybe, it's going to be a little bit triangle or pyramid shaped, peaked at the top, but it's going to be maybe a foot high, and the base is going to be maybe 15 or 18 inches wide. So you've got that piled up dirt, and you've got tubers in it. So once you start to approach the inside of that hill, you've got tubers in there, and if the ground is freezing, well, what else is going to freeze? So that's exactly what this malady is, and this is called frost damage in tubers. And the only variety that we had it in this year was Butte. It was that cold morning that we finished harvesting the crop. One of the remarkable qualities of Butte, I've seen tubers to where we've had a very cold fall and maybe a wet fall, and we're having trouble getting the crop out. And I've seen Butte to where half of the tuber froze solid, and then what happens with this variety is once it thaws out, the frozen flesh will kind of slough off. It'll just rot and fall off. And on that face between the good tuber and the frozen portion, it'll callus over. And that calloused over tuber is completely viable. It stores perfectly all winter long. We've used it again as seed the next year, and it's performed perfectly. So you take a wimpy variety, like most red potatoes are kind of wimpy varieties that need, they're kind of show horses that need to have things going right in their direction. And you take a red tuber, typical red tuber that has, even a tenth of its surface area frozen, and that entire tuber is going to melt down, and it's going to be an absolute mess. But we've seen this many times before with Butte, is that the frozen tuber, even if you get frozen tubers, they're going to heal themselves in winter, and that unfrozen portion of the tuber is going to be healthy and sound and provide good seed in the spring. Now, of course, it looks terrible. You can see on that bottom tuber in the center that there's a little bit of white mold that is growing. It was probably deep in a pallet box, had potatoes in it, had high moisture, and just like mold growing on a loaf of bread, they had enough moisture, enough starch or sugar to feed on, and that's what you're seeing going on there. But if you notice, most of the tubers don't have that. They've dried up, they've desiccated. That's allowed serious callousing to go on, and those tubers will store every bit as well as a tuber that was not touched by frost. So like I said, we had less than 1% frost damage this year. That morning, we had about an inch of frost in the hill, and we waited for a couple of hours, and by 9 or 9:30 in the morning, the frost was gone, and it allowed us to harvest the tubers. Pretty much when the ground is frozen, you can't harvest tubers because the dirt will not drop through the digger lags on the harvester or the digger. So that's my mystery malady. That was frost damage in Butte russets from fall of 2015. So the main topic of today's webinar, I wanted to talk about crop rotation, and particularly crop rotation and how it impacts not only potato farmers, but potato gardeners. Anybody that's growing potatoes, the same principles apply to whether you're farming on a large scale or a small scale. There are universal elements that you got to be aware of because it impacts you whether you're a small grower or whether you are large in scale as well. So this slide is a picture of terraced farming going on in Bolivia, which I thought was particularly significant because the high Andean region shared by Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador is the original home of the potato. Peasant agriculture has been developing and selecting potatoes for about 8,000 years. Obviously, when you've got terrace farming like that, you're in some pretty challenging conditions, and when you go to that much effort, you're going to want to maintain the productivity over the long term. So in other areas that are more flat, a common type of agriculture is to farm for 5 years, basically take farmland out of the wilds, farm it for 5 years, and then let it recover for 20 years. And then 20 years after your last crop, you come in, clear the ground again, and farm it for 5 years. What this illustrates is that cropping ground is hard on ground. And I think one of the real achievements that organic farming has been able to do is the idea of sustainable agricultural production year after year in a manner that is sustainable over the long term. So there isn't any need to have to abandon land to let it recover if you're doing the job right. And I would say that over the last 10,000 years of agriculture, the terraced farming here of the Bolivians and in other areas of the world, for example in China, if you're putting that much effort into that ground, you're not going to abandon that for 20 years or 10 years or whatever. You're going to need to crop that every year. So there's going to be that much higher level of attention to that farming to allow sustainable production year after year. But if you take, there's a lot of wisdom in 10,000 years worth of agriculture. The fact that traditional agriculture often would, after 5 years, abandon land to let it recover for 20 years before they went back into it. I think they would have wanted to farm longer than 5 years if that were possible, but I think through experiment and experience, they came to realize that that was the ideal arrangement given their ability for, their knowledge and ability for farming. So once your world population increases, it gets pretty hard to just do that, 5 years of production, and then they would no doubt move on to a different area and again for the 5 years produce that, and maybe they'd come back after 20 years or 25 years to do that. And that was one form of agriculture that would be workable when you had a small human population on the planet. That really doesn't cut it anymore. So now we have to come up with more sophisticated ideas of how we can sustain agricultural production, sustain food production, sustain the farmers that are growing the crops, keeping them economically viable over the long term. So I wanted to provide that as background for getting into some more specifics pertaining to potatoes. So this is a photograph taken in Aroostook County over 100 years ago in 1902, and a couple of things I might mention about this. This was a 10-acre field, and the harvest from this field yielded over 140 barrels an acre. And a barrel, if you look close, there's a horse up ahead at the far in the background, a white horse that has a low-slung wagon that probably held 18 barrels. And those barrels are 11-peck barrels, and they hold 165 pounds of potatoes. So this 10-acre field in 1902 generated almost 250,000 pounds of potatoes. That was what was capable. And I think this land was probably up north of Caribou, probably in the Swedish colonies, maybe New Sweden or Washburn or one of those areas, and those were settled in the 1870s. So here you'd had farming going on for about 30 years. Aroostook potato farmers had by this time already figured out that by applying fertilizer, they could significantly increase the yield. When the original settlers down here in Bridgewater in the late 1820s, 1830s, when they originally cleared the land, there was no concept of adding additional fertility, and they were able to grow good crops of potatoes from the natural fertility of the land that they had cleared. Then, as they continued growing potatoes, they found that the yields would decline, and then came this invention of synthetic chemical fertilizer, which was a way of supplying the three macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are most needed by crops, and there was a bolstering of the yield. So, farmers are good business people, and they knew that that was a good way to maintain yields. Unfortunately, it's a good technique in the short term, but as history has shown, the decline in organic matter, of which that's some of the fertility. The rough rule of thumb is that for every 1% of organic matter in your soil, you're generating about 10 pounds of nitrogen to grow a crop. And a crop of potatoes needs between, depending on the variety and length of season, needs between 125 or 140 pounds at the minimum of nitrogen for a short or a mid-season crop like Kennebec. And the recommendation for fertilizing purposes for a late season russet Burbank or a Butte would be 200 pounds of nitrogen. So say if you're starting with a soil like on Wood Prairie Farm, our soil is approximately 6% organic matter. So that means that by virtue of the available nitrogen in the soil, because of that organic matter, we have 60 pounds worth of nitrogen going into that crop that we're growing. Now, in the fullness of time, soils in this area are typically at 1 or 1.5% organic matter. Potatoes are a crop that is pretty hard on the ground, and the best way to return fertility to the ground is one's rotation. So back in this era, the common rotation in Aroostook County was a 5-year rotation. And that began with 2 years of potatoes, potatoes following potatoes. And then in the third year, they would grow oats. They would undersow the oats with clover and timothy so that in the fourth year, the clover would come up strong. And then by the fifth year, the timothy would take over. The clover would be good for a couple of cuts. They call medium clover a double cut, because you get a couple of cuts before it basically falls away. And then the grasses, which like timothy grass, which are slower to develop, they would fill in that gap. So in that fifth year of the rotation, you'd have a fairly solid crop of timothy grass, maybe 90% timothy, 10% clover. And then in the sixth year, they would go back into potatoes, and they would grow that for 2 years. So my opinion is that organic farming should never have a cash crop following a cash crop. So meaning you shouldn't be following potatoes with potatoes. You should only have a single year. And you might ask, what is the big problem with following potatoes after potatoes, or in other regions, corn after corn, soybean after soybean, sugar beets after sugar beets, wheat after wheat, something like that. And the universal problem in having either no rotation or a poor rotation is that you get a buildup of disease and insect pressure, which are detrimental to yield and quality of the crop. In addition, different crops are going to take different things from the soil. So you're going to deplete certain nutrients in the by the growing of a single crop. You're going to be concentrating your removal and depletion of those nutrients, and by rotating different crops in different biological, botanical families, you're going to have different draws upon the soil, and in some cases, if you're doing a good job with your selection of alternate crops within your crop rotation, you're actually putting things back into the soil. For example, everybody knows about legumes, that they take the air that we breathe is 80% nitrogen, and legumes have the rare ability of fixing nitrogen, taking it from the soil and turning it into a plant available form. And some crops like alfalfa and clover are so good at it that they take from the air more nitrogen than they themselves need, and they create a surplus of nitrogen, which can then be used for the next crop. So this was observed by potato farmers going back a long time, certainly back in 1902. And the idea to getting clover into that rotation was because that would help build the nitrogen content, and as well it would build the organic matter content, as would any good sod forming element in a rotation. So let me jump up 100 years to, this is our farm, Wood Prairie Farm. We have a 4-year rotation, and we're going to get in that, but you can see, just give you a lay of the land, in the background beyond our pond there, that's the home farm. And we basically have our 4-year rotation. We have 4 groupings of fields that are about 10 to 12 acres each. And the home farm is where we grew potatoes last year. And in the foreground, those fields that are all in green, those are what we call the Shaw fields. That used to be the Bud Shaw farm, which was cleared in the years right before and during World War I. So about 100 years ago, those fields were first cleared. And we've got them divided up more or less into thirds. So in our 4-year rotation, we farm on the home farm once, and then we cross the road, and then we farm the leftmost field, that green field that's probably I'm not sure what that is. This was taken, there's color in the leaves, so this photograph was taken probably in September, and you've got something green. That's probably rapeseed growing in that field, which makes sense. So in the first field, that solid green, that's about 10 acres there, and that would be in rapeseed, and the next year it would be in potatoes. So in fact, that's the same point of the rotation that we're in now, whereas we had potatoes on the home farm last year. That first field, which we call Field 31 Shaw South, that will be in potatoes this upcoming year. And we plowed that field down last thing. No, we spun last thing. We spun on, we plowed down that field last thing before freeze up. So that field will be ready to plant potatoes this spring. So in our case, we have a 4-year rotation, similar to the traditional Aroostook County potato rotation of 5 years. We have a 4-year rotation. We just knocked one of those years of potatoes off. So let me go into that. I made reference in the last webinar that I helped I was part of a group called NEON, Northeast Organic Network, and back in 2002, about 14 years ago, a group of about 12 or 15 organic farmers from Maine through New York down to Maryland got together and worked, I think we got together 2 or 3 times and just came up with advice for new and beginning organic farmers as to how to develop a rotation. You know, what elements go into a rotation, and then we shared our own examples of the rotation in this manual that came together. So at the conclusion of the slides in this webinar, there will be the URL for getting this manual. It's something that you can download from the web. It's free. I know I couldn't find it this morning, but I know I've got a bound copy. I know they made some copies and printed them, hard copies, you know, with a solid binding, but it's probably available. You could check into that following the URL that you're going to see. But the point is, you can download one for free. I would recommend downloading it and printing it out on, if you're going to print it out on a color printer, because the crop rotations are coded by color, and I think they really add a lot. So I certainly would recommend you paying attention to that. So I'm not sure how easy it is to see that. We have made one change in 14 years, and that's simply the placement. We used to grow the rapeseed as the first crop in the 4th year, and then followed it with buckwheat. And now we do it the opposite way. We do buckwheat first and rapeseed second, so that the rapeseed is closer to the potato crop, and as a biofumigant. There's a reason for that, and I'll get into that as we go. But and just to indicate what this slide is about, our friend Jean-Paul Courtiens in New York, his rotation is in the left. Roy Brubaker, another friend, organic farmer in Pennsylvania, his rotation is in the center, and our Wood Prairie Farm rotation is on the right. So our rotation is, well, let me get into it. Year 1, we grow Maine certified seed potatoes. Year 2, we go into a spring grain, usually hard red spring wheat, but occasionally oats. And then when we sow the spring grain, we undersow it with a blend of 2 different types of grass and 3 different types of clover. We're sowing typically with Climax Timothy and perennial ryegrass. And then the 3 types of clover are double cut medium red clover, Alsike clover, which is pronounced in this area Alsac clover, and then yellow blossom sweet clover. So we're spinning that on. In our case, we go through the grain at approximately 6-inch height. We go through with a finger weeder, and we do our last weeding that way, driving over some of the grain, but it will bounce back up. But with a finger weeder, we're taking out weeds and then opening the ground so that the small clover and grass seed will grab in. And anyway, that's about a month after we've seeded the grain crop. And in a year with normal moisture, we get good growth of 8 to 12 inches of clover in the first year. And then in the second year is when the timothy, which is slower growing, when that and the perennial ryegrass comes in. Okay, so we've got year 2, that is the grain. And here's a picture of year 3. Actually, it's year 3 being plowed in at the beginning of year 4. So our sod, in the first year of sod, it's going to be 90% or better clover. And then in the second year, the clover peters out, and then the timothy and perennial ryegrass comes in. So that's what you're seeing here. This is second year sod being plowed down. And we usually plow this down. Somebody, Peter or Caleb, once we're winding down potato planting, they'll go over and start to plow next year's sod. Next year's ground, which is in sod, that is going to become next year's potatoes. So they'll start to plow that down while the rest of the crew is getting the potatoes planted. So, and then in that fourth year, we have 2 crops that we grow. First, as soon as we can get the ground plowed down and roughed out with a harrow, we like plant buckwheat approximately the middle of June. And we plant buckwheat, in this case, as a plow down crop. And this is probably the nicest crop of buckwheat that we've ever grown. It was, let's see, I'm looking at the trees at the back of the field. This is Shaw North, field 33 North. And I remember it being a pretty wet year, and the buckwheat really grew tall. And I think back then we had been using herring scale. So we had clearly spread herring scale prior to putting this crop of buckwheat in. That is one luscious crop of buckwheat, and that is approximately, I would say that's probably 8 weeks from planting. It is a very fast-growing crop. And here's one of the elements that I might mention, which is an aspect of crop rotation, is that buckwheat has the ability to send its roots down deep into the subsoil, and it will bring up phosphorus from deep in the subsoil, bring it up to the topsoil, and incorporate it into its biomass. So that what I'm doing in this shot here is I've got a bush hog, and I'm chopping that buckwheat fairly short, so it's maybe, got a stem length of maybe 4 to 6 inches, and I'm going at relatively slow ground speed and relatively high tractor RPM, and this is to try to chop up that buckwheat so that it's fine, so it kind of is like a Cuisinart, and it's going to chop it up fine to allow it to incorporate quickly. But all of that biomass has phosphorus in it that the roots have brought up from the soil, and that will become available for subsequent crops like the potato crop that will be in the next year. So we love buckwheat. It really improves the tilth of the soil. It's a wonderful cover crop. We would hate to farm without it, and it's something that does well on poor soil. So if you've got a new field or a new garden plot that is a little bit sketchy in quality, you're going to want to apply some buckwheat, and you'll find a remarkable improvement to the quality of your soil. Okay, so we plow that sod in early June. Ideally, we plant the buckwheat in mid-June. 8 weeks later, we're about the 10th of August. So then we're planting a rapeseed crop, and this is at the end of the rapeseed cycle. But what they found, they began growing broccoli up here as a commercial crop for, table broccoli that you find in the grocery stores back about 1980. And broccoli is in the brassica family, and there's a problem if you grow too much broccoli. Well, if you grow any brassica too often, you can get disease problems in the soil. So good rotation is particularly crucial for members of the brassica family. So knowing this, the farmers that grow broccoli worked up an arrangement to where some of the potato farmers, they would swap ground. Potato farmers would grow their potato crops on the broccoli ground. The broccoli farmers would grow their broccoli crops on the potato ground. What the farmers observed was that the potato crops grown after broccoli were particularly high quality. The yield was higher, the quality of the tubers was better, even things like there were less weeds in the field. So scientists at University of Maine, once they heard these tales, they started to do some research, and what they concluded was that there was a biofumigation effect from growing this broccoli. So this led them to do increased research, and they came up with a regimen of, they identified different members of the brassica family, and what we plant, dwarf Essex rapeseed, is, well, at the time we got into it 12 or 15 years ago, it was recognized at that point as the second best mature brassica for biofumigation. And the measure is what quantity of, I think it's glucyanates, I think that's the primary benefit of plowing this down. And then as the gas as the green matter rots down, it gives off a gas which cleanses the soil. And the gas has a lot of similarity to a really devastating chemical fumigant, though this is a natural one, and the chemical one is a problem because it's also it causes depletion of the ozone, and it's one that's been on the list to ban it for years, but there's been concern that they don't have an adequate replacement. Well, this biofumigation seems to be doing well, and not only did scientists in Maine investigate this, but I also understand that parallel to the research being done here in Maine, there was research being done in Washington that showed very similar properties. So what does the biofumigants do? They cut down pathogenic fungi like Rhizoctonia and Fusarium, all of which lower the quality of potato crops, particularly seed crops. So we think that this biofumigation really has helped us increase the quality of our seed. Interestingly, it also will cut down that gas as the chop is decomposing. The gas given off actually causes weed seeds to die, and something like 15% of the weed seed will be reduced through that gas going off, so you actually get less weeds in the field. So one of the key elements here is that you don't want the good elements of that brassica to volatilize and go into the atmosphere. So the proper way to incorporate this is, as we're doing it here, we've got on the left you've got a tractor with a bush hog, and bush hog is what we've got. They're better choppers that chop more evenly, and that would be ideal, but this is the piece of equipment that we have. What you're trying to do is chop fine and then replace, if you're chopping 7 foot wide, then you want to replace 7 foot wide of trash going back in evenly to try to get the even benefit of this. So the point is, you don't want to get too far ahead with your chopping from your plowing. So in our case, we've got two different tractors. The bush hog on the left is going a couple of round trips ahead of the plow. We've got a 4-bottom plow on the right side. It looks like, I think that's my son Peter on the bush hog, and I think that's probably me on the plow on the right. And I'm incorporating with shallow moldboard plowing, just enough to try to get most of the rapeseed incorporated. And you can see this side of the plow, there's a little bit of green. You know, that's okay. That's a ready trade-off that I'm going to have for not plowing too deep. You want to vary the depth of the plowing that you're going to do. Like when we plow, we'll plow, you know, deep for us is 6 or 7 inch and shallow is 3 to 4 inch. So every time we plow, we try to vary the height at what we're plowing so that we don't develop a plow pan, which is a smeared, compacted surface that limits, well, it's compacted soil, so it limits root growth, it limits percolation of water, and one way that you can get away from this is by varying the depth of what you're plowing so that you're not plowing at the same depth every time. So the incorporation here of rapeseed as close as we can before the potato crop goes back into production the next year, and that would be the 5th year. So our 4-year rotation starts with seed potatoes, and then this plowing of rapeseed. This looks to me like it's probably the very end of October. We usually do this right before the ground freezes solid, end of October, 1st of November. The rapeseed is really pretty hardy. I think it'll get, you know, by the time it's getting that cold into the high teens, you're not getting enough growth to really cause it to grow taller, but we like to plow and incorporate right before we get freeze up to minimize any risk of erosion that's going on. So let me remind you that we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Feel free to throw them at us at any time. As we move along here. So I guess the thing I wanted to stress is that trying to get different plant families is one of the elements of rotation that you want to take into account. And I know this can be a challenge for gardeners if you've got a small garden patch. And, you know, a lot of people, they want to grow potatoes and they want to grow tomatoes. Some of them want to grow eggplant and some of them want to grow peppers. Well, this presents a challenge because each one of those 4 crops are all in the same nightshade family. And when you're rotating, to the greatest extent possible, you want to rotate so that you do not have the same family recurring in a given patch or in a given field very often. You would certainly, as a starting point, you would not want to follow a nightshade following a nightshade. So you wouldn't want to put in potatoes one year and do tomatoes the next year. That's just not good form, and you are going to, you know, get a buildup of disease pressure, which is going to at some point catch up to you. So you look at different crops, and I'm thinking back to different rotations that we were using as we were clearing land, clearing the trees off land or the bushes that had grown up, and bringing them back in. And we used crops like squash. That would be one family. That's a crop that is not a fine seeded crop, so it can kind of take rough ground, and it's a good way to kind of tame ground down to get it ready to plant potatoes. Also good to, if you're taking new land in, say, that has been in sod for a while, my strongest recommendation is to not go into potatoes the first year. Usually in sod, at least here in the Northeast in New England, you're going to have a relatively high resident population of some soil insects, white grub and wireworm, and both of them will be they'll do harm to your potatoes. They're going to bore into the potatoes. The white grub, they chew on potatoes, and it looks like there's teeth marks. It looks like a little mouse has been chewing with the the damage, but in fact it's white grub, which is a kind of an ugly little worm about the diameter of a pencil and about an inch long, and doesn't seem to have any eyes on it. But the alternate host, not only does it like potatoes, but it likes timothy grass. And all of the fields in New England that have been in sod for a long time, pretty much they've naturalized over to timothy. I think timothy originally came in from Europe. I don't believe it's a Native American grass, but it now has become so dominant in colonizing that most fields in New England, I'd say, at least up our way, if they're in a grass sod, the timothy is going to be a primary component of that. Well, timothy is nice for building soil. It builds the organic matter. It develops a nice strong sod that is good for increasing organic matter and humus content. The downside is that it's an alternate host for wireworm and white grub. So if you go directly into potatoes after coming out of heavy old sod, I can just about guarantee you that you're going to have a problem with wireworm. And if you're growing this in a home garden for your family's use, it's no big deal. The little boring holes that are bored by the wireworms, they're aesthetically not pleasing, but if it's food for your family, the tubers will store every bit as good. They just won't look as good. The problem is if you're a commercial grower selling into the marketplace, you don't want to be sending potatoes down the road that have wormholes in it. That's not what you call, appetizing for the folks that want to eat potatoes. So one can, run into a lot of problems. So as a rule, I would never recommend going directly into potatoes coming out of sod. If you were going to do that, I'd recommend the same regime that we do in our fourth year. Plow the ground down, plant buckwheat. You'll be amazed at how much improved the tilth is in just 8 weeks. And the key with buckwheat is that you want to incorporate buckwheat at 7 to 8 weeks. I recommend at 1 to 3% bloom. I would start to get nervous and shaky if I let it go any more than 10% bloom. And the reason is this: buckwheat is kind of a primitive grain. I think, botanically speaking, I think it's related to rhubarb. It's called buckwheat. I'm not sure where that name came from, but I don't think it's really called a grain, not like wheat and rice and oats and barley and like that. But the nature of buckwheat is that as soon as you see blossoms, there's already some buckwheat groats, the grain, that's a misnomer, but that's what they call it, the grain portion already developing. So, as soon as you see 1 to 3% bloom, there's already been bloom going on for a few days. So it ripens unevenly. And if you let it go too far, you go up over 10% and you're going to have some viable heads in that buckwheat. So when you try to incorporate it, you're actually incorporating the green matter, but you're also incorporating some viable weed seed, which may come back to haunt you in the next year. And this reminds me of a story. This is going back probably 25 years or so. And we had an inspector come over, and he was a Canadian, and he had been inspecting some organic farms on the Canadian side of the line. And he came over and he related a story to us that a farmer that we knew had planted a field of potatoes, and the year previous, he had planted buckwheat. And we used to have a group called SAVE. It stood for Sustainable Agriculture for the Valley Ecosystem. And throughout the year, we'd have meetings about once a month. In the wintertime, we'd bring in a speaker or somebody who had some area of expertise would talk, and the farmers there would it'd be kind of the focal point of a discussion. So We had talked about buckwheat at this and the importance of incorporating it early. Well, this farmer didn't always come to the meetings. He had picked up that buckwheat was a good cover crop, but he did not get this important detail of incorporating at 1 to 3% bloom, and certainly no more than 10% bloom. So in fact, what he had done was he grew the crop of buckwheat, let it grow the entire season, and then incorporated it and planted the potatoes the next year. So the inspector was kind of joking, laughing at himself, and he related that he had complimented that potato farmer on what a beautiful field of buckwheat that he had growing. And the farmer said, "No, you don't understand. That's not buckwheat. That's my field of potatoes." And in fact, the potatoes were, probably 6 or 8 inches high by that point, and the buckwheat was 1.5 feet high, and you could not see the potatoes because the buckwheat was so rampant. It looked like a solid field of buckwheat. And anyway, that I use to illustrate that timeliness is next to godliness in farming, and you want to be knowledgeable about when to do things, and then you want to do things on time. So we're a little bit on the paranoid side of getting buckwheat to grow a little bit too long to where it will come back and haunt us as a weed. Our conventional neighbors, they're using herbicide, and weeds like buckwheat coming back, that's not going to be a bother for them. Buckwheat is going to be taken out with their herbicide. But in the case of an organic farm, of course, we do not use chemical herbicides. We use the techniques. In our case, we use a flamer for getting in-row weeding. We use a finger weeder as well to get those in-row weeds between the plants in the row. And then we're using, pretty significant earth-moving techniques of hilling up soil to build a nice hill that covers the developing tubers, prevents the sunlight from exposing those tubers to daylight, and preventing, the green and bitterness that comes from light-struck tubers. As well, we're getting really good weed control when we're doing that. And if we get our timing down right, we try to make our last hilling pass right before row closure, so that as we make the pass about 5 days later, row closure occurs, which is when plants from one row start to touch plants from the other row. And another week later, you can't even see where the rows are. It looks like a solid field of potatoes without any rows. So that's when you've done things right. And when you get row closure, if you've done a good job at containing weeds the first half of the season, you can go fishing the second half of the season, because there aren't going to be any weeds that come up through. There is just an absence of sunlight getting through that canopy of potato plants. So that's another illustration of doing things on time. And when it comes to rapeseed, we've learned that you don't want to go very late in planting the rapeseed. There was one year, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, where I ran out of seed right around, it had been a wet August, I think, and I was planting on right around Labor Day. So I ran out of seed, and the way I plant my fields, I plant the headlands on both ends first, and then I work back and forth from one edge of the field across. So when I ran out of seed, I basically had a donut hole in the center of the field left over. And I think it was like on a Friday, early afternoon or so, that I realized I was running out of seed. So I went in, I got on the phone, I called our supplier out in the Midwest, and I said, I need you to send me a bag of dwarf Essex rapeseed. So they shipped it that day on that Friday, but it didn't get here until about Wednesday or Thursday of the next week. So I immediately got that seed. I got my grain drill, and I went out and I seeded that donut hole. So this would be about 6 days after that first seeding. So Labor Day weekend, probably around Labor Day was probably about the 5th. So that means I planted the majority of the field something like the 2nd of September, and I planted that donut hole something like the 8th of September. And you would not believe what a dramatic difference there was come late October. The stuff that we planted on time, you know, which was 80–90% of the field, it was a beautiful crop. It was 24–26 inches high, filled in nice. In fact, it could have been this field that you're looking at here. It was a very nice crop. However, that donut hole, just having planted it 6 days later, it really, in the fullness of time, it wasn't even worth planting. It was a waste of seed. That 6 days was very important in terms of not getting it established, not getting a good crop, not getting good size. So the illustration there is what we've learned, you know, that now that we've been growing this for a dozen years, is that the ideal time is to seed this about, in our climate up in northern Maine, about mid-August. And we have gotten good crops by seeding in early September, but I think it's risky, and I think the safer thing to do is to give yourself another couple of weeks. One of the problems is that, you know, we can get some dry spells in August, and that seed is so small, and it's just sitting on top of the soil, that if you're in the middle of a dry spell and you seed the dwarf Essex rapeseed, it's just going to sit there until you get rain, and we've seen it sit there for 10 to 14 days and not do a thing. So come mid-August, we often are paying a lot of attention to any forecast rain, and what I like to do is get the rapeseed planted right before a rain, because then you get quick germination, quick emergence, quick growth, and you're going to get a good crop. And you know, if it just sits there, it's something it's hard to get the wherewithal to irrigate a crop, at least here, when we know that in almost every year, within a week or two, you're going to get some rain. So anyway, we try to time that for right before the rain. So Beverly has a question for me here. Do you harvest any of your grain cover crops, or do you plow them all under? Well, yes, we do. That slide that I had of the hard red spring wheat showed our Massey 300 combine, and we do use that for harvesting crops. The crops that we raise are hard red spring wheat, usually hulless oats, winter rye. We have grown spelt in the past, but we gave up on that because of winter kill. I came to conclude that we had beginner's luck when we first grew it for 3 or 4 years, and then it started to winter kill, so we haven't gone back to that. But yes, we do grow the seed that you see in our catalog, you know, like Dillon wheat is our preferred hard red spring wheat now, and we've got that in the catalog and on the website, and that's wheat that we've grown. And we also grow oats and rye that you'll also find in the catalog. So things that we plow down. Buckwheat's a little bit of a queer duck. Most farmers do not direct combine that with like that photograph of the combine. That's a direct combine where you're going in and there's a mower knife and you're cutting that, and then the dry straw with the heads on top, that goes into the combine, and the concave beats the heads apart so the grain is separated from the straw, and then different functions within the combine separate the grain from the chaff, and the straw and the chaff are blown out the back, and then there's a reservoir, a tank that holds the grain, and then, you know, that's how you harvest oats, wheat, barley, rye, you know, all that is harvested the same. Doesn't work that way with buckwheat. Again, getting back to the uneven ripening, the normal way of harvesting buckwheat is to use a special machine called a swather. And a swather has a sickle bar mower knife on the front. So it cuts that grain, and then it has rubber conveyor belts that take the cut buckwheat and it places it gently into a windrow that then goes behind the machine. So when you're done cutting, you basically have a field of buckwheat that ends up as a windrowed row of buckwheat. And the old timers would cut that in the morning when there were still dew on the ground, so that would limit the amount of shattering that would go on with the buckwheat. Then you would have the buckwheat in a windrow, then you'd come back probably 5 days later and with a pickup head on a combine, and in that 5 days you would have ripening off, so that the buckwheat that you put into the combine with a pickup head, that would be all dried down more or less equally, so it would be viable. So we don't own a swather. And again, I've always been a little bit paranoid about growing buckwheat as seed for fear that it's going to shatter and come back and plague us with potatoes. And in our rotation, we make money 1 year out of 4. The grain is kind of break even. The sod crops, cover crops, those are all actually, we're investing money in building the soil. But 1 year out of 4, we're making money on our farmland, and that's in the potatoes. So we don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize that. And having a thick weed crop of buckwheat is something I don't want to do. So we'll buy buckwheat seed from other good growers that have the right equipment to harvest it. So Beverly has a second question here, and she asks, my garden is just over 600 square feet and I can't plow. Is there some way to use a cover crop in this case? Okay, so 600 square feet would be a plot 20 foot by 30 foot. I don't know, do you have a rototiller? If you had a rototiller, that's quite effective for a lot of jobs. You can abuse soil with a rototiller by utilizing it too much. Like you can use it to incorporate green matter, but you don't want to use it as your weeding technique. That's really hard on the soil and aerates the soil and destroys the organic matter. But if you've got that, I would go to our friend Carol Bryant at Scythe Supply in Washington County, Maine. I would get a hand scythe. She and her husband before her were making these for many years, and these are a great tool, and it would be perfectly suited to a crop, cropping area the size of what you're talking about. So 20 by 30 foot, it would be fun to do. If you're cutting acres and acres of hay with a scythe, I think the fun at some point leaves. But on the size that you're talking about, I think it would be fun. And you could incorporate that with a rototiller. If you don't have a rototiller, you can incorporate this with a shovel. It is harder to do. A string mower would be an alternative to a scythe. Anything that you can do to kind of bust that up to make it smaller so it's easier to shovel in, that would be a benefit. But there are appropriate tools for every scale. So yes, you can do it. Shovel is a good technique, and I do think, and there are some low-growing, rapeseed is relatively low-growing. Rapeseed, we've never been able to find that organically, so that's why you won't find it in our catalog. We have, in recent years, been able to come up with a supplier for oil radish, so I think that would probably be a good alternative among the organic seed that we offer. And that does a great job of loosening up the soil and breaking plow pans. So we've got a question from Teresa, and she asks, I have all kinds of posts on row covers for small gardens on my website, tendingmygarden.com. I do everything by hand and never till or plow. Well, Teresa knows what she is talking about. She's got a wonderful blog, tendingmygarden.com. We highly recommend that everybody go to that and sign up to get her regular articles that she writes. Teresa is an organic farmer for many decades. She's down in Virginia. She knows what she's doing, and she's going to be a lot more knowledgeable about how to be efficient on a garden scale than I am. So thank you, Teresa. I appreciate your chiming in, but I think Teresa, and she's always been very open about answering questions, so maybe putting you on the spot here, Teresa, but if you've got any questions, I think after listening to her blogs that she would be happy to help you answer them. But she does a great job with that website and blog, and certainly take advantage of her good offerings. Well, okay, and Teresa is validating my painting her into a corner and saying she is happy to help anyone who asks. And I know Teresa, and she does a great job and is a very giving person. So she's one of your secret benefits for having attended this webinar to learn about Teresa. So I see we're now up on, we're up a little bit over an hour, so we're going to wind this thing down. If you've got any final questions, please type them in and I'll be happy to answer them. I did want to remind you that this is the sixth and the last of our series this winter, and I reckon that once we get the crops harvested and the ground frozen and the first snow, that we'll probably be doing this again next December. And those of you that have signed up for this webinar and are getting it, you will be notified by email when we do start that up, so you don't have to worry. We'll give you plenty of lead time. If anyone has any further questions or comments, oh, here's something I forgot about this slide. This talks about that crop rotation manual, and Frank, I think, is typing in the URL, turning that into a hot link. So I've been referring to this NEON, Northeast Organic Network. It's based at Cornell. It was a good outfit. We did some good work. I think this manual is really beneficial. It goes into great depth, everything you wanted to know about crop rotation and then some. It's available for free download if you go to that URL that Frank just typed in. So if you go to that, that URL brings you to this page, and you'll see that there are other hot links on there. So there's different types of procedure for how to determine factors in selecting crop rotations, but this is what you call exhaustive. You can go into this and get everything you need in understanding how to do a crop rotation for your garden or for your farm. And it's important in both ways, in improving the soil, in minimizing disease and insect pests naturally. And if you do this well, if you understand your crops and understand your soil, you don't need to resort to using chemical inputs. And that's what organic farming is all about. It's trying to understand your farm or your garden's ecosystem that much better. And that when you understand it, you don't need to use synthetic chemicals. The fact is, for 10,000 years, our ancestors have been doing a very good job growing crops without synthetic chemicals. And the last 100 years of usage of synthetic chemicals is just, the last few minutes before midnight on the 10,000-year history of agriculture. So we can do a good job without poisoning our food and poisoning our soil, and that's the organic method. And it's not that we're a second-rate system, we're a first-rate system, because we're growing good food, we're not poisoning the soil, we're not poisoning the environment, we're creating sustainability over the long term so that year after year the soil gets better, so that our children are going to have better land to farm on, and they aren't going to be stuck with these synthetic long-term chemicals that are poisoning and killing the planet. So organic is the way to go. On our farm scale, we can tell you about it. On a garden scale, go to Teresa Martz and her tendingmygarden.com website. But there's no reason for having to get away from the organic principles. Organic is effective. It's the most effective system, and there's going to always be an answer when there's a problem that you encounter. So we or somebody that we know can probably help you with that. So if you do have any questions, that's our contact information. You can email us. You can call our number. We'll try and help you out. And if you do want high quality organic seed, whether it be organic seed potatoes or organic vegetable seed or organic cover crop seed, We do sell them. That's our livelihood. That's what we do, is raise and sell organic seed. And we know the best organic seed farmers in the United States, and that's who we get our seed from. So by buying from Wood Prairie Family Farm, you're getting access to the best organic seed in the United States. So we're happy to make that available to you. We've learned that good seed is the first step in having a successful farm and a successful garden. So thank you for taking part in today's webinar. As I said earlier, we will upload this to YouTube, to the Wood Prairie channel, and it'll probably be tomorrow before we email you the link, but you'll be able to watch this webinar again, or if you want to share it with friends, you can do that as well. So thanks everybody, and we're wishing you a very prosperous and successful gardening and farming year ahead.